Hopefully your expectations have not been elevated too high. Let me begin by telling you about Betsy Fornash, who was supposed to be on this panel, who wasn't on this panel. She is a wonderful, fantastic person who is here. She just happens to be in an EM Waste Management Working Group meeting right now, or FCOG Waste Management Working Group right now, but you should find her if you're interested in hearing perspectives of a federal employee who has jumped around a little bit. I don't remember exactly what she did before she was at the NEA OECD, which was an assignment in Europe, but she spent 4 years there and then was at EPA as a regulator in the WIP oversight team. And then we hired her, I actually hired her from EPA to join the DOE EM program, and she joined them in 2014 and has been basically moving up the ranks. Right now she's serving as the acting deputy manager of the Carlsbad field office, but her position of record is a deputy assistant secretary for, I think, waste and materials management here in EM headquarters. So she has a lot to say and a lot of influence. So I encourage you to find her in the halls and talk with her about that. Okay, so originally this was going to be 75 minutes. It's been shortened to it's been shortened to 60. I will run over because that's just what I do. If you get up unceremoniously and leave, I will not take it personally, I promise you. But I do hope that you stick around, and if we can make time for questions, I'll do my level best to get us there. It is an honor to follow all of those great folks who went before me. They laid a really great foundation for many of the things that I'm going to share with you. And they actually allowed me to not say some of the things that I was planning to say. Ike in particular, I think, did a great job of selling you what you already bought. I might touch on it a little bit from a personal standpoint. And believe it or not, we didn't practice, but I also have a participatory aspect here as we get started. So by raise of hands, how many of you have worked in the EM program for less than 3 years? Okay, that's a good number of you, great. Now, if you have been here more than 3 years, raise your hand and keep it up if you've been here more than 5 years. More than 10 years? Lisa, you old now. All right. And some of you, probably you guys here, and guys and gals in blue, you're not part of the EM program, right? So raise your hand if you're with a company but aren't actively working on the EM program, but your company works in the EM program. Okay, but you could potentially get assigned to the EM program, perhaps, or have opportunities there. Perfect, thank you. All right, well, let us get started. Let's say, why are we even here? So we're here because this program is vast, right? It's so huge. As Kristen, my twin sister, Kristen Ellis, as she said, Oppenheimer helped us explain our jobs, right? It gave you just a little bit of view into the complexity and history of this program. It has its own language. Somebody else, I think it was Tiffany, said there's lots of acronyms. EM really almost has its own alphabet. There are many, many actors in this play. I'm hopeful that what I share with you here today, and there's a QR code at the end of the presentation, but you have to stick around for it, that will give you a PDF material that has some of this detail. I'm hopeful that this will give you some context, some history. I can tell you that none of this made sense to me. It took me probably a good 10 years to piece together this picture, and actually I relearned and re-remembered stuff as I was preparing this presentation for you. I do hope you enjoy it. I hope also that for those of you who have been here more than 3 years or 5 years, and raise your hand if you think you really have a deep understanding of the EM program, and it's okay to raise your hand if you really think you know it. Oh, come on, some of you guys. Ken and John, you guys should at least raise your hand. Okay, thank you. I caught you not listening. All right, so I hope this just at least reminds you of just the greatness of the good things that are happening here. And again, many of the speakers before me have already made that point. So now we should say, why me? So EM was formed in 1989. I joined DOE in 1993 and immediately started working on the environmental programs. Even before I joined the programs, I was working in the chief financial office assigned to these programs as the budget analyst. And so you can kind of say that we grew up together. I worked for DOE for 23 years before I left to join the private sector. And when I started as a budget analyst, I was working, as I said, for the budget office and the CFO shop. I was an idealist, a bit of an anti-war activist. Sorry, maritime guys. But I decided not to apply for security clearance because I knew defense programs was a big part of the department, and that's just not where I wanted to work. And so I was kind of cast off to the corner and said, go work on those new environmental programs. To my benefit, I was I was hired the day before a hiring freeze that lasted for multiple years. So I was for several years the youngest person in my office. And as people left to go off and do other things, I was just able to accrue lots and lots of responsibility, probably an unusually irresponsible amount of responsibility for somebody. I was briefing the secretary, I was briefing congressional committees. I learned all kinds of great things. It was a wonderful, crazy, crazy time. But then I kind of capped out and I needed to make moves, and the natural place for me to move was into the environmental management program, which I joined after 6 years in the CFO shop, and I spent the balance of my federal career, so 17 years there. I started working on some of the most exciting things that were happening at that time, the Rocky Flats closure, where I learned all kinds of new skills, project management, contract management. Accidentally, I became a waste management expert, which is why I'm here to talk to you today, because most of what EM is about environmental management and dealing with the wastes, and eventually everything becomes a waste. So let me say it again, EM is large and complex with a deep, deep history. We're not going to cover it all in an hour. I've oversimplified some things. I've taken some liberties. You can call me on them later, but do so in private. But there is a lot of history that you can hopefully call on and draw on as we move forward. I can't figure out if I need glasses or not. I guess I don't. All right, so you know the Manhattan Project. Obviously, everybody watched Oppenheimer. We all know what happened there. Under the veil of secrecy, the first research and production facilities were quickly designed and built to support the first nuclear weapons. That gave birth to the Atomic Energy Commission. And you might think, this is an EM, why are we talking about this? But trust me, it's relevant. So they were formed in 1946 to administer and regulate the production and uses of atomic power. Their work also involved not just the managing that stockpile of weapons that was growing rapidly, but also doing research into the peaceful uses of atomic energy, including electric power generation, what became, civilian nuclear power. They also initiated the earliest studies of health and safety impacts and the hazards of nuclear materials. So then in 1975, Congress decided that, hey, this agency needed to be sort of reconstituted. It was split into two new federal agencies, the NRC, which took the civilian responsibilities associated with the civilian uses of atomic energy, and what was then called the Energy Research and Development Administration. So that's where the nuclear weapons program went. But the 70s was a time of energy crisis. Oil prices were sky high. There were gas lines. You could only get gas on a certain day, depending on your license plate, et cetera. So Congress again decided that they needed to reform federal agencies, and DOE was born by combining ERDA and several other energy-related agencies, and DOE still exists. So here's a map. This is basically a map of what the complex looked like, and I know this is difficult to see, but most of it is just look at all of the stuff that's there, right? So the blue-colored states are the ones where we had installations, and then there's lots of major sites, and then there's lots of other little dots. Former uranium mines, formerly utilized industrial sites. So these are just commercial things like warehouses in the city of New York where uranium may have been stored. So we brought lots of commercial players into the complex. And then there were, the little mushroom clouds there are three of them on that map, if you can see them. That is where the actual, weapons tests were conducted, which also resulted in contamination across the land and groundwater. And so clearly by decades of work, this is now about 4 decades into the, after the Manhattan Project, there was a lot of legacy contamination that had been generated, vast quantities of radioactive waste, surplus nuclear materials, contaminated facilities, land and groundwater, old containers that were degrading, letting wastes, leak out and lose containment. Environmental releases, some were planned, like the nuclear tests, some accidental, like the degrading drums. There were operational incidents in these facilities, fires and explosions that led to contamination. And there was increasing public awareness and concerns. Think about the 70s, a time of great activism, 60s and 70s, great activism. There was a lot of attention. 1986, Chernobyl happened. But before Chernobyl, there was a major court decision. So a number of states had sued the federal government for noncompliance with environmental laws that had been passed as a result of the environmental initiatives that grew out of the 60s and 70s. Up to that time, DOE had sworn sovereign immunity, saying that basically the government was above the reach of the law, local laws, state laws. That was cast down. And so now entered this era of all of those installations on that map needing to come into compliance or face legal fines and penalties. And so something had to be done. Then Secretary James Watkins, a Navy admiral, he formed the Office of Environmental Restoration and Waste Management, which later became the Office of EM. And this is what the first organization looked like. Remember the simplicity of this chart, because we're going to come back to it when I show you today's modern Office of Environmental Management organization. Three basic offices: waste operations, environmental restoration, and technology development. And then there was the all-important resource planning group, right? That's the one who was figuring out what it was going to cost, developing the strategies, making the budget requests. And then very importantly, and I think this is important to recognize, there was this Office of Quality Assurance and Quality Control, because we were going to need to come into compliance with a lot of technical requirements that was going to require a lot of technical data, and it had to have a certain pedigree. So yay for QA. But thus, the world's largest environmental management program was born. It was born to provide singular focus and leadership to address these legacies, to come into compliance, to address that very legal liability that was looming and growing, so that those mission programs, the Office of Defense Programs, the Office of Nuclear Energy, the Office of Energy Research, could just stay focused on their core missions and let their develop an expertise within the department that could address this kind of work. So I like to talk about EM's history in 10-year chunks. I should note that by the time EM was created, before this first decade even began, there was really important work that had already been done to set the foundation of the program, particularly the Waste Operations Group. The excavation of WIP had begun in 1982. It was completed 4 years later. Construction on vitrification facilities, and don't worry if you don't know what these things mean, I'm going to tell you in a little bit. Construction of 2 vitrification facilities had begun in 1983, one at Savannah River site called the Defense Waste Processing Facility, one at West Valley. Wastewater treatment was already underway at Savannah River. Solidification of low-level waste had already begun at West Valley, and a lot of buried waste retrieval and removal activities were happening across the complex, because there was this recognition now, as we came into compliance with federal law, that these prior historic waste management practices needed to be reversed. So when you think about the first decade, EM was focused on doing all of that site identification, defining their inventory, characterizing all of the sites and the degree of contamination, the extent of spread, how many media had been impacted, and then developing very robust programmatic environmental impact statements that would lay the groundwork of the decisions as to what site was going to do what, which facilities were going to be built where, how materials and waste were going to move between the sites. It was quite a massive undertaking, and some of these EISs took a decade to complete. Meanwhile, other large major treatment facilities and disposal facilities were being constructed. This is a period ripe with many, many important documents, publications that you can find when you follow some of the web links that are in the handout. I just list two that I found to be very foundational. One was estimating the Cold War mortgage. This is where we estimated the first environmental liability estimate. This happened in 1995. It was called the Baseline Environmental Management Report. It was updated. It's a very massive thing. I think there were probably 1,000 subcontractors working on this at one point. It became too laborious and too detailed to maintain, and so EM opted to some more efficient ways of developing this estimate, but getting it right the first time was really important. It was sort of the bounding number. It's what signaled to Congress, hey, this is the kind of investment you're going to have to make progress in this program. That other one, the black and white one, is a cover page of the Waste Management Programmatic EIS, and as I mentioned, those are big deal documents. That one took about 10 years. Other major things that happened in this period, let's see, high-level waste vitrification began at Savannah River in West Valley in 1996. So they were being constructed in 83. They got turned on in 96. WIP opened in March of 1999. But note that that was 13 years after it had been constructed. So it took 13 years, 4 years to build, 13 years to get regulatory approval in order to open it. Remember that. We'll be coming back to that point. EM's second decade. This was a great period of time. It coincides with when I joined the program, so there's that. And then there's all of the innovation that was happening in contracting. There was a strategic initiative to define 10-year plans, accelerated closure, regulatory breakthroughs. We renegotiated all of the enforceable agreements to have this assumption of reliable and predictable funding. That was a really important unifying step with our stakeholders and regulators. There was a targeted focus on prioritizing the work based on risk and figuring out how to go after the highest risks first, to buy down the mortgage, reducing the footprint to reduce surveillance and maintenance costs, and very near and dear to my heart was the accelerated site closure pilots. First Rocky Flats, that's the upper picture, and then Fernald very soon after. Rocky Flats in 2005, Fernald in 2006, the Miamisburg, Ohio Mound plant followed soon after in terms of its completion. So this was a really exciting time, probably to me sort of the brightest era of environmental management. During this decade, RH True Waste started being disposed of at WIP, which is another really significant accomplishment. So then the third day, now we're no longer a new program. Sort of the novelty has worn off. All of that predictable funding didn't keep the program from getting more costly. All of these complex facilities started to fall behind schedule. We started to get reorganized around the Department of Energy. We had basically a different manager within the upper organization of DOE almost every 2 years. It was sort of a weird place, and EM was no longer the pet project. Still, there was important work that had to get done. There were significant investments in high-risk D&D, tank waste treatment progress was proceeding. There were a number of regulatory advances being pursued, including risk-informing the radioactive waste management order. The construction of the salt waste processing facility at Savannah River was completed in 2016. It began operations in 2020 after a very well-defined operations and commissioning startup process, and it completed the sequence of a very large and vast liquid waste system at Savannah River that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And then there's EM Now. And so if I could echo what Ike was saying this morning, right? This is an exciting time for this program. They're challenging the paradigm. They're working on ways to optimize waste treatment. And with the end state contracting strategy that has been implemented over the last several EM contract awards, they're attempting to find ways to streamline contractual mechanisms and make it easier to accelerate work within a proven team that can deliver work safely and effectively. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Really exciting things. The high-level waste interpretation was issued as a limited change to DOE Order 435. We'll talk about that. IWTU operations has begun treating sodium-bearing waste at Idaho. That's a really big deal. And this picture is an aerial view of the direct feed low-activity waste treatment facility at Hanford, where recently we started heating up the melter, which is big news. So that's kind of the history. Now let's talk about the scope. So the complex that this complex was created beginning obviously with the Manhattan Project, which was developed to deliver basically the full fuel cycle to enable the production of nuclear weapons. And so what I like to do is look at the major steps of the fuel cycle so you can understand the history of the major sites, what their operations were, what primary role they played in this process, and then what waste streams were generated by them. This is a little bit overly simplistic, as I mentioned. In the history of our program, many materials move through this cycle, sometimes once through. Sometimes they moved and jumped through the cycle at various steps because our research and development activities were evolving and we needed to do different things with the material, so it may skip through. So this is not a once through, pass through, but hopefully this simplistic explanation will give you a vibe on what is the breadth of scope that EM has had to address, has successfully addressed, and why wastes are where they are today. So it all begins with uranium mining and milling. So over the years, there were up to 400 uranium mines operating in the US, primarily in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming. Remember all those little mine carts that you saw on that first map that I showed you? So at that step, uranium ore is crushed, uranium is leached out with acid, producing a yellow cake. Historically, 60 million tons of ore were mined in the US to produce nuclear weapons, and 1,000 tons of ore were needed for each kilogram of plutonium that was manufactured. So just think about the vastness of those numbers. That's why there were so many mines. The waste that resulted from this are tailings, which are the solids, and raffinates, which are the liquids, and they contain lots of heavy metals, which are bad nasties in the environment. Upper hand picture is obviously just some folks working on a mine. The lower picture is the Moab site where mill tailings relocation is ongoing today. This is one of the last ongoing projects within, I would say, this sector of the fuel cycle for us within EM. EM made great progress in the closure of dozens of other uranium mines early in the process. Second step, refining, where yellow cake is shipped to plants to be refined for future use, and multiple different uses, multiple different forms. Two major sites that were involved in this process, Weldon Spring near St. Louis, that was both a quarry and a chemical plant, had a chartered history, first doing explosives and then working on uranium. It ultimately was closed, and in large part, it was one of the earlier projects that were addressed because it presented very high and urgent risk to a large population in St. Louis, significant potential for groundwater contamination. All of those tailings were relocated into an engineered impoundment that was built into an interpretive center. So it basically now is one of those highest parts where you can overlook and see the city line. People ride their bikes on it. It's really a great recreational use of the site. The Fernald plant, you heard me talk about Fernald closure in 2006. That also ended up with a recreational use. It was turned into a natural preserve. It also has a visitor center. Again, process waste here are those tailings, those raffinates, thorium waste, as well as surplus byproduct material, which potentially still had some use and is not a waste until it's declared as such. All right, enrichment. So enrichment, the top picture is a picture of a cascade inside a gaseous diffusion plant. The bottom picture are some of the very large depleted uranium hexafluoride cylinders that were generated through the operations. So what happens in enrichment? The technology that the US used was gaseous diffusion. 3 very vast plants were constructed, one at Oak Ridge, which became the East Tennessee Technology Park, and then because of UCOR's great successes, became the Horizon Center or the Heritage Center? Thank you, Heritage Center. Vision 2020 was realized, and that site is complete. You'll see some slides of that later. Paducah cleanup's ongoing. Portsmouth is ongoing. All of the cylinders that had once been at Oak Ridge were shipped to ports in Paducah. And now we're in the process of working to convert those cylinders into a stable form that could either be reused or disposed. So after enrichment, the enriched uranium was manufactured into fuel or other target material that would be irradiated in the reactor in order to produce plutonium that was needed for the weapons. 3 major sites, other sites had roles in this, but 3 major sites, Hanford, particularly in the 300 area, Fernald again, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Process waste from these activities were low-level waste and transuranic waste from this particular thing. The upper is a uranium target. The bottom picture is a spent fuel rod. However, it's notable that there are many, many different types of fuel rods. This is probably not a rod used in the power reactor. I think this is a commercial spent fuel rod. So then there's those production reactor operations. So nuclear fuel powered the production reactors that were built to generate plutonium and tritium and other nuclear materials needed for weapons. Hanford had 9 reactors, Savannah River had 5. And this is a picture of K reactor. Excuse me, one of the last reactors built at Savannah River. It was actually repurposed after it ceased operations for production purposes to be used for nuclear materials disposition efforts. The waste that come from this step are spent nuclear fuel and spent target materials as well as transuranic waste. It's notable that Idaho National Lab, which was designated the lead lab for spent fuel management, I think built as many as 50 different kinds of one-of-a-kind research or experimental reactors, and so there is a large inventory of fuel there as well. So then reprocessing. So we spent so much time and effort to get this ore, turn it into something useful, enrich it, make fuel, power reactors, make plutonium. We had to do something so this wasn't a one cycle path, right? And so we had to reprocess the spent fuel, and some had to purify the nuclear materials that were irradiated so that we could actually get to recover the products and start the cycle again, or get the product to be just what it needed to be so it could be fabricated for its weapons use. And so very large chemical processing facilities, which for whatever reason we call canyons, were constructed, 8 of them in total, several at Hanford, 2 at Savannah River, 1 that I know of at Idaho, and then there was also a commercial spent fuel reprocessing facility constructed at West Valley that, after years of operations and some issues, closed for financial and technical reasons, and it was assigned to the Department of Energy, and that is our West Valley site today as we know it. So these pictures, the upper picture is H Canyon at Savannah River site, still operating. It is the only operating chemical processing facility in the United States, in our complex. The lower picture is sort of 8-pack of high-level waste tanks. This is a historic picture of like what they look like while they were being constructed decades ago, before all of the soil was filled in around them. This could be the 8-pack at Idaho, but I'm not actually sure of that location. My apologies. I can research it for you if you need me to. All right, so this is sort of the derivation of what happens after you've done that fuel cycle, you've obtained this material that you need now to turn it into whatever shape or form is needed. My graphic artists love this picture. In the top picture, that's a plutonium ball that was generated relatively recently at Los Alamos. The bottom picture is a photo of canisters that are used to disposition surplus down-blended plutonium oxides. They're called 3013 containers. So that's sort of an example of how we're dispositioning material. So key sites back during the historic production, Rocky Flats for manufacturing of plutonium forms, Los Alamos as well. And then today there are modern national security sites in the NNSA complex that are performing these, and those operations are going to, similar to the historic ones, generate transuranic waste and low-level waste. And not all waste, or not all of the materials end up being used. So some of the materials generated become surplus and are transferred to EM for management and disposition. All right, so this gets you to sort of the third chapter of this overview, and that's, now that you understand the history of the sites and where waste came from which type of operation, this is how EM organizes its program and its scope today. There are 5 major pieces: tank waste, true and solid waste, which predominantly I refer to as low-level waste. The purple, that's special nuclear material and spent nuclear fuel, facility D&D, and soil and groundwater, and we'll go through each of them somewhat quickly. But before we talk about tank waste, we have to sort of spend some time on radioactive waste management policy. And a little bit of a warning, I am a total waste nerd, so I run the risk of taking you deep down this rabbit hole. I've been coached over the recent days to keep this at a reasonably high level. And so there are really 3 concepts I want to share with you. I want to give you the foundation of the waste types, what type of waste falls into that waste class, and then some key elements around the disposal considerations and the status of disposal availability for those waste types. So first and most important point, DOE is self-regulating in its management of radioactive wastes. So from the radioactive portion of waste, not the chemical, but the radioactive, the Atomic Energy Act says DOE's in charge, which means the NRC doesn't really have to be in our business, the EPA doesn't have to be in our business unless we're non-compliantly doing it. So if we generate it and package it safely, we can do it all without ever getting any external approvals if it's going to DOE sites. And the way we do that, our rule is DOE Order 435, Radioactive Waste Management. That order defines these waste classes, but we had some help from statute in defining the first 2. So high-level waste, that's that liquid waste that resulted from the reprocessing, that chemical dissolution and separation of spent nuclear fuel. But it's not just the liquid waste, it's also the solid waste derived from that liquid waste if it is sufficiently if it has sufficient concentrations of fission products, that it would require permanent isolation. And that is basically a nuclear safety case question. It's hard to tell, and that's really the focal point of the high-level waste interpretation, is what and how do we make that determination that it requires permanent isolation or not. Transuranic waste. Oh, by the way, high-level waste, defined also in law by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Transuranic waste, defined by law in the WIPP Land Withdrawal Act, is waste, very specifically, that is not high-level waste, that contains greater than 100 nanocuries per gram of alpha-emitting transuranic isotopes with half-lives greater than 20 years. That's a mouthful, right? I mean, so it's very specific. If it contains 99 nanocuries per gram of alpha-emitting transuranic isotopes, it's not true waste, it's low-level waste. And low-level waste is any other radioactive waste that's not high-level waste or true. So it's not defined deterministically, it's defined by exclusion, and so it has the greatest breadth and diversity. In DOE space, we have low-level waste. In NRC space, for commercially generated low-level waste is broken into 4 classes: Class A, Class B, Class C, and greater than Class C. Greater than Class C is the most radioactive, has the greatest concentrations of long-lived radionuclides, and requires the greatest packaging and the greatest isolation for safe disposal, but more on that later. High-level waste, because it's so long-lived, so radioactive, is assumed to require permanent isolation. It requires the siting of a geologic repository. There is not one suitable or licensed for high-level waste. The Yucca Mountain program had been pursued by the department for decades. It was canceled in 2008, I think, permanently. Is that the right year? And basically, there is not a replacement repository now. The Office of Nuclear Energy is looking at options. There's a consent-based siting process, but basically, high-level waste has no path, and therefore spent nuclear fuel also has no path. Transuranic waste also requires, by law, geologic isolation, and the site developed for that is the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant near Carlsbad, New Mexico. I'll show you a schematic of it in just a moment. Low-level waste in our cases, we've demonstrated, all classes, even up to greater than Class C, can safely be disposed of in near-surface disposal facilities, and we have a wealth of those in our complex. But first, tank waste. Here again is that picture of the high-level waste tank farms being constructed. Tank waste is absolutely EM's greatest challenge. It makes up about a third of the annual budget. It is going to be the longest schedule in terms of our to-go environmental liability and projects. There is a lot of innovation still needed here, and a lot of hard work. But it's an area where you could spend your career, your grandchildren's career probably, and maybe even your great-grandkids' career. The picture on the bottom being carried by the forklift, that's a high-level waste, a canister of vitrified high-level waste from the Savannah River Defense Waste Processing Facility that's being arranged for storage in the canister storage building. And then the lower right-hand side, that's an aerial view of a high-level waste tank farm after it's fully constructed and operated, right? All of the soil's filled up, concrete pads on top of it, lots of piping, and that's how we access the tanks for sampling, or through ports there on the top. There obviously is a very complex web of piping between those tanks that lead also to the treatment facilities, and there are multiple dozens and dozens of tanks at some of our sites. So here's a map of the disposal complex available to the United States, and it may not be apparent to you, but it's important to note that the US is rich in disposal capacity. Other countries who also have used nuclear power, who have developed atomic weapons, don't even have near surface disposal facilities in many cases, right? And so we need to recognize sort of the gifts that we've built ourselves, but we also need to protect them, because it took a long time to develop this framework, and some of these facilities, as they entered the market or entered the complex, it took decades to secure approval for them, whether it was from stakeholders, host communities, regulators, or or even, just our own internal decision-making processes. So the blue sites are commercial facilities. There are two predominant commercial facilities that EM utilizes. One is in Clive, Utah, Energy Solutions. It accepts Class A, so that's the lowest class of low-level waste, low-level and mixed low-level waste. Mixed low-level waste is radioactive waste that contains a hazardous constituent. That's why we call it mixed. The other is waste control specialists. That is a engineered, it's a complex that has multiple facilities, but that complex can take Class A waste, also B, also C low-level waste, and there's a cell for commercial waste, and there's a cell for federal waste, which is predominantly Department of Energy wastes. There are some other commercial disposal facilities in the United States, but they are either limited to receive only commercial waste from specific states as a matter of the Low-Level Waste Compact Act, or they have a waste acceptance criteria that is not very accommodating. Their capabilities are just not structured really to support the at-scale volumes that EM ships. So I don't want to leave you with the impression these are the only players. There are others, but these are the two predominant ones, and the ones that EM contracts via nationwide disposal contracts. There are treatment capabilities at the sites as well that help for the disposition of waste. The purple sites are all DOE sites. One disclaimer, Paducah is on here, and by the way, I should give credit to this. This is a graph or a graphic that appears in the ECA's Disposal Drives Cleanup publication from last year, so I got some permission to use it. Paducah is listed there because there is the potential. There is a proposal on the table for development of an on-site cell to support disposal of the waste that will be generated from the gaseous diffusion plant at Paducah as that project proceeds, but there's not been any decision there. So the parenthetical that you can't quite read there does note it as potential. And then importantly, WIP is on here because it is a DOE site, but that is a geologic repository that can only accept defense true waste. All the rest can accept low-level waste. Another important one I'd like to mention is Nevada. Nevada operates as a regional disposal facility. It can take waste from any qualified, certified DOE generator site. It can accept both low-level waste and mixed low-level waste. I know I told you that in DOE space, there's just low-level waste class, but I talked about Class A and A, B, and C for the commercial sites. That's because when DOE uses commercial facilities that are licensed by the NRC, we have to manifest our waste and certify that it meets waste criteria that are consistent with their licenses, and their licenses obviously follow that NRC waste classification scheme. All right. So a little bit more about disposal. True is on the top. So that's a schematic of WIP, of what the WIP facility is designed basically is. It's a little bit simplistic, but it has surface facilities where the waste shipments come in. The waste is, those containers, the transportation packages are open, but the waste containers are not open. There's no treatment capability at WIP. It comes in, it has to be fully certified to be acceptable. It's unloaded from the casks, and then it moves down vertical shafts more than 2,000 feet below the Earth's surface into mined disposal rooms and caverns. That picture there shows you one of the disposal rooms, and that's basically what true waste looks like after it's taken out of a true pack. The black are wrapped standard 55-gallon drums full of waste, and the white are standard waste boxes is what they're called. And I failed to tell you about what waste looks like back when I was telling you about the waste classes. So transuranic waste, like what would transuranic waste be? It could be trash, tools, it could be activated metals, like the pieces of fuel cladding. It could be soil, it could be equipment that was contaminated with plutonium or other transuranic radionuclides. It could be compacted drums that used to hold true waste that have then been placed in another drum, so drums inside of drums. It could be, as I mentioned, downblended plutonium oxides that have been deemed surplus to the nuclear weapons use, right? And so we downblend them to terminate safeguards and that designate them as a waste, and that resulting waste qualifies as transuranic waste because of its concentration of transuranic radionuclides greater than 100 nanocuries per gram with half-lives greater than 20 years. So it's a very specific classification scheme, but the diversity of form, there's multiple packages that can come, but the shaft is only so big, so it's a very, very prescriptive, highly regulated environment. On the lower half of the picture, this is my favorite disposal cell in the complex. This is the mixed level waste cell at Nevada. You can see how nice and orderly the waste is disposed of in modern days. Those are, again, 55-gallon drums of waste on pallets. Behind them are some Connex boxes, is what we call them. They're the kinds of things you see stacked on rail cars moving down the rails. All right, so here's a picture of packaging and shipping. Again, the transuranic waste on the top. So that's transuranic waste in drums that have been wrapped that are being placed into what's called the TruePack 2 container. There are 3 of them on that truck that's heading south from Los Alamos down to Carlsbad. Those transportation casks are certified by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So one of the limited number of things that the NRC does in regulatory space in our complex, in our program. The bottom picture is a very important picture to me. This is the first shipment of converted depleted uranium oxide. So cylinders from enrichment were processed through the conversion facilities at Ports and Pad. This one's from Paducah, converted into a U308 stable form that could either be reused or meet the acceptance criteria for a low-level waste disposal facility. This is probably close to 100 cylinders in probably 20 or 30 rail cars on their way to waste control specialists. And the reason this is so important to me is I was the lead officer for the NEPA for depleted uranium oxide disposal 13 years ago. So this shipment just happened, I think, last month. So it took a long time, a lot of debate, a lot of controversy over whether or not depleted uranium with its long-lived radium issues could be safely disposed in a near-surface facility. But congratulations to the EM team for taking this to demonstration. So let's move out of waste into nuclear materials. Special nuclear material and spent nuclear fuel, by definition, are not waste. They are materials that have value. They may not have a mission purpose, and if they don't, they've been transferred to environmental management for storage. At the start of the program, I think EM had 2,400 metric tons of spent fuel. Again, as I mentioned, there are hundreds of different types of fuel. So not an easy program for us. I think when EM started, there were 100,000 kgs of uranium and plutonium oxides that required stabilization, 700,000 metric tons of depleted or other uranium that required packaging. I mentioned those 60,000 depleted uranium hexafluoride cylinders from gaseous diffusion activities. So a lot of scope that had to be stabilized. Much progress was made by EM in the first 20 years. Jay Roderick, fist to you, man, because he was one of the guys who was making it happen. He's in the back of the room. A lot of urgent risks associated with these materials, a lot of security issues associated with these materials. So storage was consolidated to the minimum number of sites. Damaged fuels were treated and packaged, awaiting future geologic disposal. Most wet storage facilities were closed, transitioning materials to dry interim storage. This is a picture of dry storage casks at Idaho containing, I think all of those in the background are commercial fuel types that have been received. And I think all of those casks, most of those casks might be under NRC license today because the fuel came from an NRC licensed activity. In the foreground, those vaults on the ground are below grade storage vaults that also contain spent fuel in a dry storage configuration. This, for reference sake, is a picture of a wet storage basin. This is the Advanced Test Reactors Basin up in Idaho. ATR is an operating reactor for the NNSA missions today. It's working hard to de-inventory its wet pool and getting as much of it to dry, but I don't think there's a strategy yet to go straight from the reactor itself when the fuel is spent into dry. I think there's always going to be the need for at least some short period of cooling. That takes us then to facility D&D. So facility D&D, deactivation and decommissioning. Sometimes that D stands for demolition, depending on the type of facility. There's probably 4 or 5 slides here because this is a very diverse area of scope. Again, getting back to the diversity of legacy that EM assumed. When EM started, I think there were 3,000 industrial facilities. Sorry, that's me. There were more than 500 nuclear facilities. So think Cat 1, Cat 2 nuclear facilities, and more than 1,000 radioactively contaminated facilities. So that's quite a lot. All of that had different kind of contents, different kind of equipment. Think about the diversity of sites, the diversity of functions they were performing in the fuel cycle. It's a lot. So you're going to hear this term, glove box. How many people know what a glove box is? That's a pretty good showing. Okay, so here's a picture. It's basically a piece of equipment, leaded glass, leaded gloves. It allows the worker to see the nuclear material they're handling, but they're protected from the radioactive hazards of it. But the inside of those glove boxes gets super crapped up. And there's hundreds of these in these complex processing and nuclear facilities that have to be cut up. So transuranic waste might contain glove boxes. Low-level waste might contain cut-up glove boxes. The leaded glass might go to low-level waste. The innards of the metal and such that have become activated might be transuranic waste. It's not a simple thing. It depends on what's going on in the glove box. There is a massive initiative happening right now in the United States to manufacture nuclear quality glove boxes to support the modern, production of plutonium pits that are needed. So we're not going to see the end of this. We'll be dispositioning glove boxes forevermore. Hot cells, even more complex structures within our buildings. So now we're talking about remote handled material. So thicker walls, you can see through them only through really thick windows of multiple layers of glass. We can't even handle the materials through leaded gloves, right? It's all robotics with complex manipulators and other things. Imagine cutting this up, every single piece of equipment and wiring, right? So hot cells have successfully been cut, entered, decontaminated to the extent possible, turning pieces and parts into various waste streams. A hot cell might go 5 different places in terms of disposal sites, but it takes years and years of planning to safely, decommission a hot cell. So I talked about the range of facilities, nuclear facilities. We have a range of strategies to stabilize or get rid of facilities. So here's an example of what's called in situ decommissioning. This is the B reactor at Hanford that has been cocooned. So after a period of deactivation, and I should have started here. So facility deactivation is when you shut down the facility. You basically turn it off. Facility decommissioning. The decommissioning is removing the equipment, removing the power systems, the electrical lines, the water lines, et cetera, basically rendering it in a cold, dark state, effectively. And then what else? You're going to demolish it, right? That's the third D, unless you don't, right? You might get it to a place where you remove the major hazards inside, but you're taking advantage of the very robust structure of that, or there might be a component in there like a reactor that needs to stay there because it just needs to decay, because we don't have the mechanism to deal with it safely on the outside. So we leave it in there, we grout it, and that is an interim action that will be stable for hundreds of years. So this is at Hanford. It actually also was turned into a museum. We've done this at multiple other reactor sites at Hanford as well as Savannah River. But here's a cooling tower. This is K reactor cooling tower at Savannah River. I actually thought you were going to get to see that video and see it come to the ground. My apologies that you can't, but that was destroyed during the Recovery Act, a period of added funding a little more than 15 years ago. It was brought to the ground via the use of explosives. And then there's the more conventional manual way of tearing down a building. And this is one that I'm sure Ken's very, very proud of. This was the K-25 facility. It was the Oak Ridge gaseous diffusion plant. It used to be in the shape of a U. About a mile of facility under roof, very complex cascade system, highly contaminated, lots of uranium holdup. There were criticality concerns within that. And so you could see how the building had to be segmented. Different parts of the building had to go to different waste disposal sites because of the uranium content within there. And this was done with just sheer brute force and yellow iron, and workers at the face pulling off pieces as necessary and building piles that would then be packaged safely to go off and go to waste. So my message here is facility D&D is a really exciting area to work in. It takes many forms, but it all ultimately generates waste. And then the last element, soil and groundwater, which oftentimes doesn't get enough press or hype because it sometimes is viewed as the lowest risk activity within EM's prioritization scheme, but it's ubiquitous. It's an activity that has to happen at every single one of the sites. And as I talked about, there was, sort of pretty extensive contamination as a result of our historic operations, particularly at some of the sites where we had reactors. Reactors were close to water. Fuel was stored in wet basins close to riverbeds. When those fuel pools leaked, we had, potential exposure into the groundwater source or the water, the river itself. And so massive pump and treat systems have been developed that feed upon the contamination data that's built by a large network of monitoring wells that have been installed across the sites. This is one of the larger pump and treat systems, maybe the largest in the complex. This is 200 Area West at Hanford. There's a similar type facility, it's called Alfall 200, which is going to be constructed at Oak Ridge to deal with mercury contaminated groundwaters. On the soil side, so soil remediation could involve just removing the upper inches or feet of the Earth's surface, and that's getting at sort of that air dispersed contamination, maybe from a weapons test. It could be from the spread of contamination from a uranium tailings pile that wasn't protected. This is a picture of soil remediation at Nevada. You can see the guys are still dressed out in protective PPE. Sometimes, though, soil remediation involves digging up those historic burial sites. So this is the exhumation of a historic disposal area at Los Alamos. That was called Material Disposal Area B, MDAB, where we basically had to dig trenches and remove, degraded drums. So all of that scope, right, is, I said, DOE self-regulating in its management of its radioactive waste. I also told you there's chemical constituents, and that's subject to external regulation. Back in '84, we lost sovereign immunity. We have to comply. There's a lot of people involved in that process. So some of the important statutes to know: CERCLA, which is also referred to as Superfund, gives EPA some predominant oversight responsibility. RCRA, also known as the Solid Waste Act. This is where the states have the authority to regulate the chemical constituents, chemicals and hazardous materials. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act, as I mentioned, defines high-level waste and assigns the federal government responsibility for developing the geologic repository for spent fuel and high-level waste. WIP defines transuranic waste, establishes EPA as the regulator of WIP, and makes it our responsibility to disposition defense transuranic waste. It also has a statutory limit to how much transuranic waste can be disposed of at WIP. Whether or not WIP's mission is ever expanded to other waste forms, non-defense true waste, or other waste forms that require geologic disposal is a very controversial topic, but it is the only operating geologic repository in the US and one of the only in the world. So it would be a shame to not expand its use and build upon our success there. It has a very supportive local community. The Low-Level Waste Policy Act defines commercial waste management as the responsibility of states, and any waste generated by federal or military Department of Defense. Low-level waste is the responsibility of the Department of Energy. I mentioned 1984, we had to come into compliance. We negotiated enforceable agreements, so tri-party agreements in some cases, bi-party agreements in others, but these were negotiated beginning in 1989, the Hanford Tri-Party Agreement. You may have heard that mentioned by one of the previous speakers. That's DOE, EPA, and the state of Washington and the Washington Regulatory Agency. We have similar agreements at many other states. Sometimes we don't comply with those agreements, and then we get court orders or consent decrees that implement additional requirements. And as I mentioned, the NRC has some limited responsibilities, certifying certain shipping casks. They have consultation activities for closures of high-level waste tanks at Idaho and Savannah River. And then they are the licensing entity for certain commercial origin spent nuclear fuels. It's a complex picture. Actually, before I go there, we go back one. So I'd also like to mention that there's a lot of support from the National Laboratory System, and EM's lead lab is the Savannah River National Lab. And because this is such a complex environment or regulatory framework, the Savannah River National Lab developed something called the Regulatory Center of Excellence, which provides for sort of the consolidation of the best practices and lessons learned to deal with these complex technical issues as we start to embrace approach regulatory innovation to address the balance of the program that remains. And so I just want to give a shout out for the Regulatory Center of Excellence. Some of those people will be here this week. And if you're interested in that kind of forward-thinking, science-informed partnership with stakeholders, communities, and regulators, I encourage you to seek out the panel on Regulatory Center of Excellence. Just find some folks at the LNA booth. We can tell you about it as well. All right, so back to business. Where is EM now? This was that picture you saw before, sort of right about the time that EM was being established. This is the picture now. So they're down to what they call 15 active sites. 14 of them are cleanup sites. The 15th is WIP, which is not contaminated. It's deliberately got what we put there, right? It's radioactive on purpose because we are safely disposing of transuranic waste there. There's quite a lot to do. You heard Ike talk about an $8 billion annual budget. When EM was formed, their budget was less than $3 billion. It's grown to $8 billion. It basically generally has always received the budget it needed to comply and maintain the complex in a safe configuration. That is, I think, indication of strong bipartisan support, continued support for the importance of this program. Ike said about $400 billion to go. I think it could get as high as $500 billion. Not trying to be pessimistic, but it gets more expensive every year. So it's incumbent on us to figure out ways to reduce that mortgage, find ways to accelerate the schedule, find ways to cut out unnecessary treatment or handling steps, try and get ourselves, make the most of the facilities we have, minimize the construction of new facilities, et cetera. These colors correspond to those scope bubbles that I showed you before. So you can see 38% of the budget is radioactive tank waste, nominally 20% in facility D&D, 13 in true and solid waste, 13 in soil and groundwater, just 6 in special nuclear material and spent fuel. Again, that's because so much progress was made in the early decades of EM to stabilize that. And then the balance of the budget is, site services and other things. That's the federal salaries, the grants that we have with stakeholder groups, other non-labor activities that have to happen to keep things moving along. EM gets its budget from 3 different appropriations. The vast majority comes from what's called the Defense Environmental Management Appropriation, but they also get non-defense funds for their non-defense sites, which date back to the origin of nuclear energy or Office of Science legacies being transferred to EM, and then the Uranium Enrichment Decommissioning and Uranium Enrichment D&D Fund was established specifically to fund the cleanup of those 3 gaseous diffusion plants. So that money only goes to Ports Pad and previously Oak Ridge. All right, so this is the very simple org chart of EM today. We won't go through it in detail. I'll just draw your attention to the fact that the field site managers report in at the top line. They report into Ike. I think I had some numbers here. Now I do need glasses. Talking about budget, I think there are about 1,400 federal employees complex-wide, and about 1,000 of them are at the field sites where they're managing the work, managing the contractors who do the work, managing the policies, et cetera. And then the balance, the other 400 are split between EM headquarters or the EM Consolidated Business Center. So you ask yourself then, how does all this work get done, right? So it gets done through contracts. 95% of the money that comes to EM is spent on contractors. So that workforce is probably about 25,000 large across the sites. And I'm talking about prime contractors and the subcontract workforce. And the companies to whom these contracts are awarded compete for them, but they are called prime contractors. And then prime contractors hire companies like the one I'm part of, Long & Ecker and Associates, to be subcontractors. You heard Ken talk about his partners. The great thing about many of these prime companies is that they view the businesses, large and small, that they bring in at the second tier as true partners. They realize that we bring expertise and specialty skills that augment them, and then they are managing the work, and effectively it's a wonderful arrangement. When these sites are competed, the vast majority of site performers, so contracts are competed, companies change, but the vast majority of the folks who are working for the contractor don't change. It's just their company of employment changes. The company that's paying their paycheck changes, but their jobs are not directly impacted. It's the highest level of management that moves over into some other responsibility. So I don't want you to think that this presents a great amount of instability for you if you're planning to be a site contractor. So I don't know where Anna is in UCOR land. UCOR is going to be there forever, but if UCOR isn't, trust me, like she'll have a job, right? So she's going to be able to keep doing whatever she's doing. We're not going to walk through this process. This graphic is in your handout, so you can see it. The green shapes in the process flow are the DOE actions. The others are where industry is responding. In most cases, we respond as teams where multiple companies come together and form a single purpose entity for purposes of going after the job. This is basically the world of business development. You heard a couple people talk about being in BD. Jenny Stoltz had a stint in BD. Somebody from HII stood up and said he had just left Maritime and is working in BD. You can spend your career here. This is a full-time job, chasing and developing proposals and preparing the teams and defending the proposals and being in a situation to secure the win and then supporting the transition. It's an exciting world, and one that I think you would learn a tremendous amount if you spent any amount of time there. But I don't know if it's where I'd want to spend the entirety of my career. I like being closer to the getting it done work, basically being part of the implementation. But it takes all types to make it work. There are a few major awards that are pending in DOE space. Hanford Tanks is a very big contract. The OSMS contract that involves operations of those Stuff 6 conversion facilities. Nationwide D&D and ER contracts are pending for award, and then an upcoming competition is one for the next phase of cleanup at West Valley. So that brings me to the end. I can't believe I was almost on time. So this is a slideshow that's just going to highlight a few of what I think are some of the coolest moments in EM's history. Rocky Flats before, Rocky Flats after. But I wanted to just spend some time giving you my sell on why work in EM, why you guys with the blue shirts, you guys and gals with the blue shirts should think about taking an assignment at one of the EM cleanup projects, maybe N3B. We need some good people at N3B, which is the Los Alamos Legacy Cleanup Contract. I find this work so exciting. I think we are making a difference. All the reasons that Ike said, I won't repeat them. This is noble work that makes a difference. It's going to make a difference for future generations. It's going to make a difference for the current generations. It's the way that some impacted societies and communities are going to find opportunities to get their kids educated and get high-paying jobs, and it's going to lift them up. It's going to make an economic difference to some communities. But it's also, I think, full of individual performance potential for you, right? I mean, you could develop all kinds of new skills and have you could travel around the country if you're willing to make moves. I was like Ike. I didn't think I was going to work. I didn't think I was going to be a public servant. I ended up in DOE truly because I dropped my resume in a box at a job fair. I thought I was going to be in academia for all of my life, but I got a call and I needed a job, so I took it. And then I refused to get a security clearance, and here I am, right? So I was a liberal arts student, but I now am the chief operating officer of a technical support organization, and I spent my career working on very technical issues and developing policy for environmental cleanup. And I did that because I just had an abundance of opportunity, and I have a passion to learn, but I had an abundance of supportive people around me who said you could do it. And I truly believe, like, it's been a wonderful journey, right? And when I left, I didn't retire from DOE. I left DOE because I had stopped learning. I was not enjoying the bureaucracy of being a federal employee anymore. And I sought a place where I could continue to work on the program that I cared so passionately for. And I am able today to continue to work in the transfer of EM's experiences to other countries so that they can learn from our lessons and not have a 40-year journey to the same success points that it took us 40 years to get to. And so I encourage you to find that path. And then when you know that you're topped out, find a different path to follow your passion. So I didn't think I'd spend my career here, but I was lucky enough to find myself here. I hope you feel the same way, or that you find your way here if you can. Again, this QR code will get you to a handout that's about 9 pages long. It doesn't have all the photos, but it has a page that gives you a bunch of web links. I want to endorse EM's website. You might have to navigate through some very fine print to get to certain historical sources, but like 5 clicks away through lots and lots of fine print, there is a wealth of information on sort of the path we've taken. The Office of Legacy Management has great history on the sites that have been completed. And then ECA's page is also there in the resources, and they have some really, really cool, very modern publications, and then a guide to sustainable environmental management that I think you might find interesting. So thank you for your attention. I do think we're at the end of our time, but I welcome any questions, and I will stand here as long as you have questions. But if you're bored and want to go to a reception, I understand that too. Wait, he's giving me the hook though. No, it's okay. Am I getting hooked, or are there questions? Did anybody learn anything? All right, that's a couple of hands. That's enough to justify it. All right, guys, thank you very much. Do you have announcements?
A couple of announcements, yes. So thank you, Christine.
Don't clap again.
So that's the end of our programming for today, but I guess I would leave you with a request, and that is please do take part in the survey. Our vision for this is something we'll continue to do, and that this is a community, hopefully, that we're building to achieve so many of the things that we've talked about here today. But thanks for hanging with us. We hope you learned something. We hope this motivated you. We hope this sparked some discussion, and that it sets some context for the rest of the week here, right, at the National Cleanup Workshop. So thanks for your attention, and let's have a good rest of the conference. And there is a reception waiting for us. So thank you.